The woman had two burn scars that ran from her collarbone to her left elbow, pale, raised, unmistakable. She had earned them inside a burning helicopter in a country she was never supposed to have been in, pulling men twice her size through smoke and fire while her own skin blistered and split. She never talked about it. She didn't need to. But the moment a billionaire's wife looked at those scars and screamed across a pristine VIP hospital ward and demanded that this woman be removed from her sight, the hospital executives didn't hesitate for even 1 second. They chose money. And in doing so, they had no idea they had just fired the only person standing between their patient and a professionally trained assassin already walking their halls. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now because this channel is where stories like this live. The ones that gut punch you, make you question everything, and leave you completely unable to look away. Hit the like button too, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled, because people from places I've never even imagined keep finding their way here, and that means everything to me. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened inside Harlow Memorial Medical Center on that particular Tuesday in March, you need to understand the woman they threw away. Nurse Marlo Voss arrived at 5:47 a.m., which was 13 minutes before her shift technically started, which was how she always arrived, which was something nobody at Harlow Memorial had ever once acknowledged. She came in through the side entrance near the loading dock because the parking structure closest to the main lobby cost $11 a day, and she wasn't about to spend $11 a day on parking when the side lot was free and the walk took 4 minutes. She knew the walk well. She had timed it. She had also, in the 2 years she'd worked there, memorized which floor tiles near the radiology corridor had started to separate from the grout beneath them, which elevator had a door that hesitated a half-second too long before closing, and which supply closet on the third floor had a lock that only engaged properly if you lifted the handle slightly while turning the key. She noticed things. That was the simplest way to put it. She dropped her bag in the break room, poured coffee that had been sitting since the overnight crew made it, didn't complain, and pulled up the patient board on the wall-mounted terminal before the charge nurse had even clocked in. Harlow Memorial was a mid-size regional hospital in Callaway, North Carolina. Not a trauma center technically, though it handled more trauma than its designation suggested because the nearest level 1 facility was 45 minutes away, and people in Callaway County had a habit of not making it 45 minutes. It was the kind of hospital where the nursing staff did more than their job description said they should, and where the administrative staff spent a disproportionate amount of time managing the concerns of wealthy donors whose family members occasionally required medical care and expected that care to come wrapped in something resembling a 5-star hotel experience. Marlo was 34 years old. She had 2 burn scars, one that began just below her left ear and curved down across the side of her neck and collarbone, and a second that covered most of her left forearm from the elbow to just above the wrist. The skin there was lighter than the rest of her, smoother in a way that wasn't quite right, the kind of texture that made people look twice when they noticed it. She had stopped caring about the looking twice several years ago. She had never really cared about it in the way people expected her to, with pain or self-consciousness or a need to explain. The scars were there. They were part of her. They were connected to a version of her life that she had closed like a book and placed on a very high shelf. Not because it was shameful, but because it was finished, and she was here now, and here was where she wanted to be. She had a way of moving through the floor that the more experienced nurses recognized, and the newer ones couldn't quite figure out. She was efficient, but it didn't look like efficiency. It looked like stillness, like she was the only calm object in a room full of motion. She spoke quietly, made direct eye contact, and had a habit of arriving at a patient's bedside approximately 30 seconds before the monitor alarmed because she had already read the early indicators in the patient's breathing pattern, or skin color, or the subtle change in the way they were holding their shoulders. She had never been able to fully explain how she knew. She just did. The morning census was full. 17 patients on her floor, 3 of them flagged as requiring elevated monitoring. She took the handoff report from the overnight nurse, Priya Sandhu, who was visibly exhausted and mispronouncing half her words, and absorbed the relevant information while Priya talked, asking 2 clarifying questions and nothing more. Then Priya was gone, and Marlo started her morning assessments, and the hospital came alive around her the way it always did. The overhead pages, the squeaking wheels, the distant sound of someone in 308 asking for more blankets. It was an ordinary morning for approximately 2 hours. At 7:51 a.m., she was in the medication room pulling the morning doses for her assigned patients when her charge nurse, a broad-shouldered, perpetually harried man named Douglas Keat, appeared in the doorway with an expression she had learned to associate with administrative interference. "Marlowe," he hesitated. "The VIP suite on 6. She looked up. "I'm not assigned to 6. "You are now. Hendricks called in. You're cross-covering." He lowered his voice slightly. "The patient in 601 is the wife of someone important, Renata Ashby. Her husband is one of the hospital's— I know who he is." Everyone who worked at Harlow knew who Garrison Ashby was. His name was on the new surgical pavilion. His name was on a plaque in the main lobby. His charitable contributions to the hospital over the past decade were frequently mentioned in all staff emails with the kind of reverence usually reserved for institutional founders. "What's her diagnosis?" "Scheduled knee procedure. Pre-op this morning, surgery at 10. She's comfortable. She just needs monitoring and pre-op prep." Douglas paused. "She's particular." "Particular." "She sent the last 2 nurses away." Marlowe set down her medication cup. "Both of them." "Both." "Fine." She finished pulling her medications, logged the documentation, and handed Douglas a folded note with 2 patient instructions she needed him to relay before she made it back downstairs. Then she took the elevator to 6. The 6th floor of Harlow Memorial was different from the floors below it, in the way that expensive things are different from functional ones. The difference was visible, but hard to immediately quantify. The ceilings were the same height. The equipment was largely the same equipment. But the lighting was warmer, the hallway was quieter, and there was a small seating area near the nurses' station, with chairs that someone had actually chosen rather than ordered from a bulk catalog. Room 601 had a window that looked out over the hospital's meditation garden, though Marlowe suspected most patients didn't use it for meditation. She knocked twice, pushed the door open, and introduced herself. Renata Ashby was 61 years old, small-boned and impeccably composed despite the hospital gown, sitting upright in the bed with her reading glasses on and a tablet propped against her knees. She looked up when Marlowe entered, and for exactly 1 second, her expression was neutral. Then her gaze moved to Marlowe's neck, then to her forearm. The neutral expression changed. "What happened to you?" she said, not with concern, with something else entirely. "Old injury," Marlowe said, reaching for the blood pressure cuff. "I'm going to take your vitals, and then we'll go through your pre-op checklist. Are you having any—" "I'd like a different nurse." Marlowe kept her hands moving. "I understand. I'll see what I can arrange after we complete your— I want a different nurse now." Renata Ashby's voice had taken on a particular quality, controlled but cold, the kind of cold that came from decades of expecting to be accommodated. "I don't want someone who looks like that touching me before my surgery. It's upsetting." Marlowe set the blood pressure cuff down. She looked at Renata Ashby for a moment. Not with anger, not with hurt, just with the same direct, steady attention she gave everything. "Mrs. Ashby," she said, "I'm here to make sure you're medically prepared for a safe procedure. My appearance has no bearing on my ability to do that." "I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm asking you to leave." Marlowe was quiet for 1 more second. Then she said, "I'll let the charge nurse know." And she walked out of the room and back to the elevator. Douglas was on the phone when she got downstairs. She waited. When he hung up, she told him what had happened in 2 sentences. He rubbed his face. "Okay, I'll try Hendricks again. She's due for her pre-op checklist in 40 minutes. Someone needs to do it." "I know. I'll handle it." He was already picking up the phone again. Marlowe returned to her floor and resumed her morning. She had completed 2 medication rounds and was updating documentation on her 3rd patient when her charge nurse appeared again. This time, he wasn't alone. Beside him was a man she recognized as Harlow's director of patient services, a man named Victor Pruitt, who wore a tie every day regardless of temperature and had a way of standing with his shoulders very slightly back, as if prepared to project authority at any moment. "Marlowe," Douglas said. His voice had changed. "Can we step into the conference room?" She already knew. She had known from the moment she saw Pruitt's face. They sat down. Pruitt did most of the talking. He used the words patient comfort and exceptional circumstances and sensitivity to donor relationships and administrative determination. And when he was done talking, the thing he had said underneath all of it was this. She was being suspended pending review, effective immediately, and she was to surrender her badge to security upon exiting the building. The patient reported feeling distressed, Pruitt said. We take patient distress very seriously. Marlowe looked at him. What specifically was reported as the cause of distress? A pause. The patient indicated she found your appearance upsetting. My appearance? That's correct. Marlowe was quiet for a moment. And the hospital's position is that this constitutes grounds for suspension. The hospital's position is that under these particular circumstances, you're suspending me because a patient didn't like looking at my scars. Pruitt adjusted his posture slightly. I wouldn't characterize it. That's what happened. She didn't say it loudly. She said it the way she said most things, directly and without performance. That's what you're doing. Pruitt looked briefly uncomfortable and then arranged his face back into administrative neutrality. HR will be in touch regarding the review process. We'd ask that you I heard you. She stood up. I'll gather my things. She walked to the break room, retrieved her bag, her phone, her insulated coffee mug that she'd brought from home. She did not slam her locker. She did not linger to say angry things to Douglas, who was standing in the hallway looking like he wanted to apologize and couldn't figure out how. She paused next to him for one moment and said quietly, The patient in 312 is going to spike a fever by noon. His morning labs are trending, and whoever takes over my assignment needs to watch his respiratory rate. Douglas nodded, looking miserable. She walked toward the elevator. She made it approximately halfway across the lobby. The ambulance bay doors opened. 2 paramedics came through hard and fast with a gurney between them, and the man on the gurney was somewhere in his late 40s, unconscious, dressed in civilian clothes that were torn at the knee and across one shoulder, with a road rash along his left cheek and a laceration above his ear that had bled enough to darken the collar of his shirt. The paramedics were calling out vitals and mechanism of injury, MVA, Highway 61, approximate speed at impact, and the ER charge nurse was moving to intercept them. Marlowe stopped walking. Something was wrong. She couldn't have said, in that moment, exactly what it was. She hadn't yet seen his chart. She hadn't heard the full handoff. She was standing 20 feet away in the lobby with her bag over her shoulder and a badge that had been revoked, watching a trauma patient come through the doors like she'd watched hundreds of trauma patients come through doors. But something was wrong. His injuries, the road rash, the laceration, the unconscious presentation, were consistent with what the paramedics were describing. But the angle of the road rash was wrong. Road rash from a highway impact at speed has a direction to it, a vector, because the road surface takes skin in one motion. What she could see from where she stood had a different pattern. It was distributed in a way that didn't match a single impact event. And the laceration above his ear, she had seen that type of wound before. Not in traffic accidents, somewhere else entirely. In circumstances she had spent a long time not thinking about. She stood still for 4 seconds. Then she slung her bag back over her shoulder, walked through the lobby, and pushed through the doors into the emergency department. Hey! The ER charge nurse, a woman named Felicia Drummond, who Marlowe knew reasonably well, looked up with surprise. Marlowe, you're not on the schedule down here. I know. She moved to the gurney. Walk me through the scene. What? You can't just... Felicia. She kept her eyes on the patient. What was at the scene? What did the paramedics say about the vehicle? Felicia looked at her for a moment, then looked at the paramedic who was completing his handoff, who was a young man named Torres who had been on the job for about 3 years. Torres, to his credit, answered the question rather than asking who she was. Single vehicle. Impact with the median barrier on 61 northbound. No other vehicles involved. Driver was unresponsive at scene, seatbelt on, airbag deployed. Speed? Estimated 60 plus based on damage. Skid marks? Torres paused. What? Were there skid marks at the scene? Pre-impact braking. He thought about it. No. The highway patrol guys said it looked like he didn't brake. Marlowe looked at the patient's hands. His knuckles were clean. No defensive bruising, no impact pattern across the backs of the hands or forearms consistent with someone who'd gripped a steering wheel through a collision. The airbag had deployed. A driver who experienced airbag deployment almost always showed some bruising or abrasion across the hands and wrists from the wheel and the bag itself. She looked at the IV line the paramedics had placed. Standard protocol, running at a normal rate. She looked at the bag. She looked at it again. "Who set up this IV line?" she asked. "We did," Torres said. "Standard saline push, we were treating for shock en route." She looked at the label on the bag. It was handwritten, which was not unusual for a field start. But the handwriting was not the same as the handwriting on the rest of the documentation that had come in with the patient. "I need to pull this line," she said. Felicia stared at her. "Marlowe, you don't have... I need to pull this line right now." She was already moving. "Get me a replacement bag. Saline, sealed, from your stock. Don't use what came in with him." "You are not even supposed to be in this department. You don't have authorization to..." "Then get a physician in here," Marlowe said, "and tell them to look at this IV bag before anything gets pushed through it." The ER attending physician was a man named Dr. Callum Osei, who had been at Harlow for 6 years and had the particular quality of a physician who had seen enough unusual things to take unusual concerns seriously when they came from someone who sounded like they knew what they were talking about. He came around the corner at a fast walk when Felicia flagged him, took one look at Marlowe's face and said, "What?" She told him. Not everything. She didn't have everything. She told him what she'd observed about the injury pattern, the missing defensive bruising, the breaking question, and then she told him about the IV bag. He looked at the bag. He looked at the label. He was quiet for a moment. "Pull it," he said. They pulled it. The replacement line went in from Harlow's own pharmacy stock, sealed, verified, documented. The patient's vitals, which had been trending in a direction that could have been explained by shock, began to stabilize within 12 minutes of the line change. Osei sent the original bag to the lab with a priority flag. He did this quietly, without paging overhead, without making an announcement. He had the instinct of someone who had learned that certain situations were better handled without noise until you knew what you were actually dealing with. He looked at Marlowe. "Who are you?" he said. "I'm a nurse, 4th floor." "Why are you down here?" "I was leaving," she said. He absorbed this. "Are you leaving now?" She looked at the patient. The man was still unconscious, still unidentified. No wallet had been found at the scene. The highway patrol hadn't yet matched his plates. And the phone that had been in his jacket pocket was a burner with no contacts and no call history, which was information that Felicia had mentioned almost as an aside, and which had struck Marlowe like a very cold, very specific kind of alarm. "Not yet," she said. 23 minutes later, the lab called back. Osei took the call at the nurse's station. Marlowe was standing close enough to hear his side of the conversation, and she watched his face change as he listened. He asked 2 questions. He thanked the caller. He hung up and looked at her. "There was potassium chloride in that bag," he said, "enough to stop his heart before he made it to surgery." Marlowe said nothing. "That is not what paramedics carry," Osei said. "No," she said. "It's not." The weight of that landed between them. Potassium chloride was not a field medication. It was not something that ended up in an IV bag through accident or mislabeling or cross-contamination. It was specific and it was intentional, and it had been in the bag that came in from the scene with this unidentified man whose injuries didn't match his accident and whose phone had no contacts. Someone had tried to kill this patient. Not just tried, had already placed the mechanism in the field, which meant the attempt had been coordinated before he ever arrived at the hospital, which meant whoever had done it had known where he was going and had known it fast enough to intervene at the scene before EMS arrived, or had intervened on EMS directly, which was a thought that Marlowe allowed herself to register and then set aside for 2 seconds while she identified the next most important thing. "Your security cameras," she said. "Who has access to your security footage?" Osei blinked. "Why?" "Because whoever did this knew what hospital he was coming to, and if they had access at the scene, they may also have someone here." The ER went very quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when people suddenly understand that the walls they're inside have different implications than they thought. Osei picked up the phone and called hospital security. Marlowe went back to looking at the patient. She stood at the bedside and studied him. His face, his hands, The specific pattern of injuries that she now understood had been staged or at minimum complicated by something that had happened before the crash, not during it. His face was unfamiliar. She didn't know who he was, but she had a sense, the kind of sense that she had learned over years of operating in environments where that sense was the difference between correct action and fatal error. That whoever he was important, not in the way that Garrison Ashby's wife was important, in a different way. In a way that had generated enough threat to put a compound in his IV line while he was still on the highway. She pulled a chair to the side of his bed. She sat down. She was not going anywhere. 40 feet away, in the main lobby she had almost crossed 20 minutes earlier, a man in scrubs that fit him slightly too perfectly was walking toward the information desk. He had a badge clipped to his collar. The badge had a name on it and a department designation. He had a face that nobody would remember, not because it was plain, but because it was arranged in a way that specifically did not invite attention, a face that knew exactly what it was doing. He asked the information desk volunteer a question about radiology directions, listened to the answer, and then walked past the desk toward the elevator instead of toward radiology. He pressed the button for the emergency department. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and he stepped out, and he looked down the hallway toward the trauma bay where a nurse with burn scars was sitting next to a bed. And he stopped. He stood very still, and then, very slowly, he stepped back. Because he recognized her. Not from the hospital, from somewhere else entirely. The man in the too perfect scrubs stood at the end of the hallway for exactly 4 seconds. Marlowe didn't see him do it. She was looking at the patient, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the small muscular tension around his jaw that suggested he was not as deeply unconscious as the monitors implied. That some part of his nervous system was working hard on something his body wasn't ready to show yet. She had her hand resting near his wrist, not taking a pulse formally, just present, the way she had learned to be present in places where attention was the only tool available. She didn't see the man step back into the elevator. But she felt the quality of the hallway change. It was not something she could explain to anyone who hadn't spent years in environments where that particular skill was survival critical. The ER was busy. It was always busy. Low-grade chaos organized into function. But there was a texture to a space when someone in it was doing something that didn't belong. A slight disruption in the ambient noise pattern, a change in air pressure that wasn't physical but registered anyway. She had felt it before in places much worse than this. She stood up from the chair. She walked to the door of the trauma bay and looked down the hallway. The man was gone. The elevator indicator showed the car going up. She stood there for a moment, cataloging what she'd seen in the periphery. The scrubs, the badge, the specific way he had been moving, which was the walk of someone who knew exactly where they were going right up until the moment they didn't. She filed it. She didn't have enough to act on yet. She went back to the bedside. Dr. Osei came back 7 minutes later with the security supervisor, a stocky man named Garrett Briggs, who had the slightly defensive posture of someone who had been doing an uneventful job for a long time and was now being told the uneventful part might be over. He listened to Osei's summary with his arms crossed, then looked at Marlowe. "You're the nurse from 4?" he said. "Yes." "You're not supposed to be down here." "I'm aware." Briggs looked at Osei. Osei looked back at him with the particular expression of a physician who was not interested in jurisdictional conversations at this particular moment. Briggs exhaled through his nose and uncrossed his arms. "All right," he said. "Walk me through what you saw." She told him about the man in the scrubs. She described what she could: approximate height, build, the specific fit of the clothing, the badge, the direction he'd come from, and the direction he went. She described the 4 seconds of stillness, which she knew sounded like nothing, but which she was certain was something. Briggs wrote in a small notepad, "You got to look at the badge?" "Not the name. It was clipped at the collar. I didn't have the angle." "Department?" She thought about it. "The color coding was blue, which on your system is lab services or housekeeping," Briggs said. "Neither of those has a reason to be walking toward the trauma bay without equipment." Briggs looked at her for another moment, then flipped the notepad shut and went to make a call. Osei came to stand beside her. He kept his voice low. "The patient still unidentified. Highway Patrol ran the plates. Car is registered to a shell company, Delaware Incorporation. No useful information. His fingerprints have been sent to the state database. We haven't heard back." "How long?" Could be hours, could be nothing. He paused. We've also been told, by Pruitt from administration, that this patient should be kept quiet. Those were the words. Kept quiet. No press contact, no external communication about his presence here. Marlowe looked at him. Who contacted Pruitt? I don't know. He called down here about 20 minutes ago. He said there had been a call from a county-level official requesting discretion. Which official? He didn't say. Osei rubbed the back of his neck. I don't love any of this. No, Marlowe said. You shouldn't. She went back to looking at the patient. His color was improving. The stabilized IV had made a real difference, and his blood pressure was moving in the right direction. The laceration above his ear had been cleaned and closed with steri strips. He would need imaging when he was stable enough to move, but that was not yet. She thought about the potassium chloride. She thought about the car with the Shell company registration. She thought about a burner phone with no contacts, and the specific, deliberate blankness of someone who carried nothing that could be used to identify them. Not as paranoia, but as protocol. She thought about the man in the elevator and the 4 seconds of stillness when he had recognized something that made him reverse direction. She thought about her own left arm, about the helicopter, about the places she had been and the things she had learned in those places, including this, that people who carried nothing identifiable and who were being actively killed were not random targets. They were specific ones. And specific targets meant specific intelligence. And specific intelligence meant someone, somewhere, knew something that other people needed them not to say. She did not say any of this out loud. She went and found Felicia Drummond at the nurse's station and asked her a very specific question, whether anyone had attempted to access the Trauma Bay patient's chart in the electronic system in the past 45 minutes. Felicia pulled it up. 2 accesses. The first was Osei's, logged at the time of admission. The second was a login under a name Felicia didn't immediately recognize from a terminal on the 3rd floor, 11 minutes ago. Who is that? Marlowe asked, looking at the name on the screen. Felicia frowned. I don't think I know that name. Is that name in the staff directory? Felicia typed. Searched. Looked up. No. They looked at each other. Call Briggs back, Marlowe said. The next 40 minutes were the kind of 40 minutes that moved both slowly and very fast. The particular temporal distortion that happened when a situation was serious enough that every detail required attention, but the full picture was still assembling itself from incomplete pieces. Briggs mobilized his security team, such as it was. 3 staff members on day shift, 2 more he called in early. He pulled the camera footage from the lobby and the elevator bank and found the man in the scrubs. Got a partial on his face from one angle, incomplete but enough to confirm he was not a Harlow employee. He had entered through the main lobby, badge in place, walked with the specific purposeful confidence of someone who had rehearsed the route. He had not been seen exiting, which meant he was still in the building. Briggs wanted to call a lockdown. Osei wanted to call the police. Marlowe said, quietly but clearly, if you call a visible lockdown right now, he'll know you've made him and you'll lose him in the evacuation. And you have no idea how many exits he's mapped. Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man who was rapidly revising his understanding of who he was talking to. What do you suggest? He said. Quietly reposition your staff on the exits. Don't change the overhead lighting. Don't change the overhead announcements. Keep it normal. Get me a current map of the floor layout for every level. She paused. And someone needs to move that patient. Move him where? Somewhere that isn't on his chart. Osei said, we can't move him without a physician order, and I understand the process, Marlowe said. I'm telling you what needs to happen before the process finishes. She looked at Osei directly. He was almost killed once already today. The attempt failed. Whoever sent that person does not stop at one attempt. Osei held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the charge nurse and started giving orders. They moved the patient, carefully, quickly, without overhead announcements, to a room on the 2nd floor that was technically a step-down observation unit for post-procedure patients. It was not on the ER census board. His chart was flagged with a security hold that Osei and the charge nurse set up, which required a secondary password for access that was not distributed beyond 3 people. It was imperfect. It was the best available option in the time they had. Marlowe walked beside the gurney for the hold transfer and then took up a position in the hallway outside the room. Felicia appeared at her elbow. You can't just stand there all day, she said. You don't have a shift here. Prewitt already called down twice asking where you were. What did you tell him? I said I didn't know. Felicia's jaw was tight. Marlo, what is happening? Marlo looked at her. Felicia Drummond was competent, direct, and not easily rattled, which was why she was an ER charge nurse and not a floor nurse. She deserved a real answer. Someone tried to kill that patient before he got here, Marlo said. I think someone in this building may be trying to finish it. I don't know who, and I don't know how many, and until I know more than that, I'm not moving from this hallway. Felicia stared at her. Okay, she said finally. Okay? Okay, I'm getting you a chair. She came back with a chair and a granola bar, which Marlo accepted without comment and ate standing up, because sitting felt wrong right now. The patient regained consciousness at 10:23 a.m. It was not a gradual emergence, not the slow surfacing that most patients made coming out of deep unconscious states. He came back fast and disoriented and immediately wrong in the specific way of someone whose body was used to threat response. Someone whose first instinct on waking in an unfamiliar place was not confusion, but assessment. His eyes opened and went straight to the door before they went to the ceiling. His right hand moved first, reaching for something at his hip that wasn't there. The phantom motion of a reflex that was much older than this hospital room. Marlo was in the doorway. You're in a hospital, she said, loud enough to reach him, calm enough to not escalate the physiological alarm she could see running through him. You were in an accident. You're safe right now. He looked at her. His eyes were dark and very clear and doing rapid, systematic work, taking in the room, the monitors, the IV line, the door, the window, the distance between all of these things. Who are you? His voice was rough from unconsciousness, but the words were precise. Marlo Voss. I'm a nurse. Which hospital? Harlow Memorial, Callaway, North Carolina. A pause. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, but a recalibration. How long? You came in about 90 minutes ago. Anyone else know I'm here? She looked at him. That is a very specific question for someone who was just in an accident. He held her gaze. He was deciding something. She could see it happening. The rapid, calibrated process of someone determining how much to reveal and to whom based on extremely limited available data. The IV line, he said. Someone changed it. Yes. That was you. Yes. Another pause, longer. Why? Because the original one would have killed you. He was quiet for several seconds. His jaw worked once, the way people's jaws worked when they were processing something that had physical weight. Then he said, Is there a man in this building who doesn't belong here? Marlo felt the confirmation land in her chest like something clicking into place. We believe so, yes. We're working on locating him. He's not alone, the patient said. There will be at least 2, possibly 3. She kept her expression level. How do you know that? Because that's the minimum for this kind of operation. He tried to sit up and his face went tight with pain. Ribs, she thought. At least 2 cracked on the left side from the impact. I need to make a phone call. There's no phone in... I need to make a phone call, he said again, with the particular insistence of someone who understood that what they were saying was more important than their physical state. I have a number. It's memorized. You need to let me call it. Who does it reach? He looked at her directly. His eyes were steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm. It was the steadiness of someone who had learned to keep things level when leveling things was the only available option. The people who are trying to keep me alive, he said, before this happened. Marlo went to find a phone. The call took 4 minutes. The patient, who had still not given his name, which she had stopped pushing on, spoke in short, clipped exchanges that gave her almost nothing, except the confirmation that whoever was on the other end already knew something had gone wrong and had been trying to reach him. She stood in the hallway outside and heard his voice through the door, controlled, specific, conveying information in a compressed way that suggested he had done this before, that this was not the first time he had needed to communicate urgently from a compromised position. He hung up. She went back in. How long? She asked. He understood the question. They said 90 minutes, maybe less. Who are they? He shook his head once, not a refusal, more like an answer that the question didn't have room for yet. Is this hospital secure right now? He asked. Partially. What does partially mean? It means we've repositioned security staff on the exits and we've moved you off the ER census. But we have a security team of 5 people covering a building with 11 floors and approximately 400 staff members on shift. She said it without inflection. It was what it was. There is a person in this building who entered under a false badge. We have a partial image from the lobby cameras. We believe there may be more. The patient was quiet for a moment. The woman who asked security to reposition on the exits, that was you? Yes. You worked out the camera vulnerability before you called security. Yes. He looked at her, really looked, the way people looked when they were revising a previous assessment. His gaze went just briefly to her left arm, not with the reaction she was used to, with something else, something that she couldn't quite categorize, recognition adjacent, but not recognition exactly. What did you do before this? He said. I was an army medic. He nodded slowly, as if that answered more than the question asked. She did not ask him the same question back. She had stopped needing to. The trouble came at 11:09 a.m., and it did not come from the direction anyone was watching. It came from the administrative floor. Victor Pruitt appeared on the second floor with 2 security guards, not Briggs's people, but the 2 from the main entrance, whom Pruitt had apparently redirected without clearing it with Briggs. And he walked to the nurse's station with an expression that suggested he had been informed of approximately 1/3 of what was actually happening, and had decided to respond to that partial information with maximum institutional authority. He found Marlowe in the hallway. Ms. Voss. His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. You are currently on suspension. You were asked to leave this building. Instead, I am told you are on the second floor, involved in the care of a patient you have no authorization to treat, and that you have been issuing instructions to security personnel. Mr. Pruitt, she said, which is a serious violation of your employment terms and potentially of hospital liability. Mr. Pruitt, she kept her voice level. The patient in that room was the subject of a deliberate poisoning attempt before he arrived at this hospital. The compound used was potassium chloride, placed in his IV line at the scene. Dr. Osei has documented this, and the sample is currently with the lab. Additionally, there is at least one individual in this building who entered under a false badge and who accessed this patient's chart remotely from a terminal under a name that is not in our staff directory. Pruitt stared at her. I'm going to need you to involve law enforcement immediately, she continued. Not hospital security, local law enforcement, and then federal, because what you have in that room is not a traffic accident victim, and this situation is beyond what this hospital has the infrastructure to manage alone. Pruitt's face had gone through several changes during this speech. It had started at righteous administrative authority. It had moved through surprise. It had settled somewhere between genuine alarm and the particular discomfort of a person who had been running a situation based on false premises and was now being confronted with the actual one. Who told you? He started. I told myself, Marlowe said, because I was here and I was paying attention. Briggs appeared at the end of the hallway, slightly out of breath. He had gotten there fast. He looked at Pruitt and then at Marlowe and then back at Pruitt. Sir, he said, I need my door staff back on the exits. Pruitt looked at the 2 guards he'd brought with him. Then he looked at the closed door of the room at the end of the hall. Then he looked at Marlowe with an expression that was, for the first time, not one of administrative authority, but of something considerably less comfortable than that. Call the police, he said finally. It was not a confident directive. It was a man giving a direction he wished someone else had already given before he'd gotten here. Already in progress, Briggs said. He had his phone to his ear before the sentence finished. It was 11:14 when Briggs's door camera picked up the secondary threat. A woman, not the man in the scrubs, a different person entirely, exiting the stairwell on the second floor at the east end, which was the opposite end from where Marlowe and Briggs were standing. She was dressed in civilian clothes with a visitor badge, which was a different approach entirely, and she was moving with the particular kind of unhurried deliberateness that was worse than urgency, because it meant she had a plan, and the plan did not require speed. The camera image came through to Briggs's phone. He showed Marlowe without speaking. She looked at it. 2 approaches, 2 different entry strategies, opposite ends of the floor. The patient had said at least 2, possibly 3. They weren't trying to get away. They were trying to finish. I need everyone off this hallway, Marlowe said. Right now. Briggs, your closest staff member? Where? Stairwell at the west end, second floor. Get them to the patient's door and tell them not to open it for anyone. She was already moving. Where's the second nearest? Lobby. Not useful. Prewitt. She looked at him directly. Go to your office and call County Emergency Services. Tell them you have a potential criminal situation requiring law enforcement. Tell them you have a patient under active threat. Use those words exactly. Prewitt looked like a man who had aged several years in the past 4 minutes. Yes. He turned and went. Marlowe moved toward the east stairwell because the woman with the visitor badge was coming from there, and there was only one person on this floor right now who knew what this was, and that was her. The hallway was not long, 40 feet, maybe 45. She covered it at a controlled pace, not running, because running changed the sound profile of a hallway and changed what people around you did. And right now she needed the people around her to continue doing normal things, because normal was the only cover either of them had. She pushed through the door to the east stairwell. The woman was on the landing between the first and second floor, coming up. She stopped when she saw Marlowe. They looked at each other through the gap in the railing. The woman was perhaps 40, well-built, with a visitor badge from the oncology department on the 4th floor. She had nothing in her hands. The absence of something in her hands was very loud. Wrong floor, Marlowe said. The woman said nothing. Oncology is on 4, Marlowe said. You want to go back down and take the elevator. The woman's eyes moved, a quick, specific assessment, left to right, taking in the stairwell, the door above her, the distance between them. Okay, the woman said. Her voice was flat and completely neutral. She turned and started back down the stairs. Marlowe stayed at the door and listened to the footsteps until they reached the ground-level exit. Then she went back into the hallway and walked the length of it to the patient's room and knocked twice. Briggs's security man, a young guy named Perez, who was clearly not paid enough for whatever he had just been drafted into, was outside the door with his back against the wall, looking like he was trying very hard to appear competent. Anyone come by? Marlowe asked. No one. Not even staff. Good. She looked down the hall. Did you see a woman? Visitor badge, 40s? Went past about 2 minutes ago, Perez said. Toward the west stairwell. Toward Briggs's man. She grabbed the radio from Perez's belt and clicked it. Briggs. His voice came back immediately. Here. Woman with a visitor badge, oncology designation, moving toward your west stairwell now. She's not here for the patient. She's mapping exits. A pause. Got it. Then lower. Marlowe, we have a problem on 6. She went still. What kind? The guy with the fake badge. We found him on 6. Another pause. He's in the VIP suite. She felt it happen in her before she understood it. Not recognition exactly, just the reconfiguration of a picture she had been looking at from the wrong angle. Room 601. She thought about it. The timing. The original approach to the trauma bay. The 4 seconds of stillness when he'd seen her and reversed. He hadn't reversed because the operation was blown. He'd reversed because she was a specific problem. And then he'd changed targets, gone upward, to a floor where he had an entirely different kind of leverage. Who's on 6 right now? She asked. 2 staff nurses. 1 security guard. Brief pause. And Renata Ashby. The patient's door opened behind her. The man who had no name leaned against the doorframe, jaw tight, one arm pressed to his cracked ribs. He had heard Briggs's voice through the radio, or enough of it. They changed targets, he said. Yes. Why 6? Why that patient? Because she's the reason I was suspended this morning, Marlowe said, and whoever sent these people did their homework. She looked at him. They know who I am. They know I'm the reason the first attempt failed. And right now, on the 6th floor of this building, there is a man with a false badge who knows that the fastest way to neutralize me is to put someone I'm responsible for in danger. He stared at her. Go back inside and do not open this door, she said. Then she handed Perez his radio back and started for the elevator. Briggs's voice came through the radio she no longer had. She could hear it faintly, asking for her position, asking what she was doing. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. On the 6th floor, in the room with the meditation garden window, a man who had entered through the service corridor in laundered scrubs was standing at the foot of Renata Ashby's bed with a calm expression on his face, and Renata Ashby, who 8 hours ago had screamed at a nurse with burn scars to remove herself from her sight, was looking at him with an expression she had never once worn in her life before this moment. Pure animal terror. The elevator ride to the 6th floor took 19 seconds. Marlowe counted them. She had nothing in her hands. Her badge had been surrendered to security downstairs, which meant she had no swipe access to the restricted wing of 6, which meant she would have to go through the main nurses' station, which meant someone would either let her through or they wouldn't. And she had approximately 19 seconds to decide how she was going to handle whichever one it was. She thought about the man at the foot of Renata Ashby's bed. She thought about the woman on the stairwell with empty hands. She thought about the patient on 2 who had reached for a weapon that wasn't there because his hands remembered a different version of being in danger. The elevator opened. The 6th floor nurses' station was 15 feet ahead of her. 2 nurses, she recognized one of them, a woman named Sandra Pollard, who had been at Harlow for at least a decade, were at the desk. The security guard assigned to 6 was a man named Dwight Cale, 50s, who did the VIP floor rotation because it was usually the quietest assignment in the building. He was sitting in the chair beside the station. She looked at Cale first. "There's a man in 601 who doesn't belong there," she said. "He came in through the service corridor. He has a false badge." Cale stood up from the chair immediately, which told her his instincts were still working even if the job had gotten slow. "How do you—" "Briggs knows. He should be on your radio." She was already moving past the desk toward the restricted wing door. "Open this." Sandra Pollard looked between Marlowe and the door with the expression of someone absorbing several pieces of contradictory information at once. "You're suspended. You're not supposed to—" "Sandra." Marlowe stopped. She looked at the woman directly. "I need you to open that door." Something in Marlowe's face did what words weren't managing to do. Sandra reached under the desk and hit the release. The door clicked open. The restricted wing of the 6th floor had 4 rooms. 3 of them were currently occupied. Room 601 was at the end. The best room, the one with the garden window, the one Garrison Ashby's money had effectively reserved. The door was closed. The hallway was very quiet in the way hallways went quiet when they shouldn't be. Marlowe could hear Cale's footsteps behind her. She held up one hand without turning around. "Stop," and he stopped. She stood outside 601 and listened. No voice, no movement. The television was off, which it hadn't been when she'd come up here this morning. She remembered registering the sound of it when she'd knocked, a morning news program playing at low volume. She knocked. Nothing. She turned the handle. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open 2 inches and stopped. The room was wrong, not wrong in an obvious way. Nothing overturned, nothing broken. But the chair beside the bed had been moved 3 feet to the left, which was not where chairs ended up when patients moved them, and the monitoring lead that should have been attached to Renata Ashby's left index finger was lying on the mattress, unclipped. Renata Ashby was not in the bed. Marlowe took the room in one continuous sweep. Bed, bathroom door open, window intact, closet door closed. She crossed to the closet and pulled it open. Empty except for Renata Ashby's overnight bag and the folded robe the hospital provided VIP patients. The bathroom was empty. She went back to the door and looked at Cale. "She's not here. Pull the camera footage on the service corridor right now. I need to know which way they went in the last 15 minutes. Cale was already on his radio. She turned and looked at the room again. The monitoring lead on the mattress, the moved chair, the television off. She thought about the order of events, the man standing at the foot of the bed, Renata Ashby's face. And then she thought about something that the picture had been missing until now. Renata Ashby had a knee procedure scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning. It was now nearly 11:30. The procedure had either been postponed or it had happened, and she was still in recovery, which would mean she went back to the nurse's station fast. "Mrs. Ashby's surgery this morning. What happened to it?" Sandra was already pulling it up. "Postponed. The OR called it at 9 because she was distressed. After the situation with you this morning, she asked to reschedule. So she had been in this room since 9. She had been in this room when the man with the false badge came through the service corridor." "Where's the service corridor access on this floor?" Marlowe asked. "East End, past 604. She went. The service corridor on 6 was a narrow utility passage used for linen carts and equipment transport. Not glamorous, deliberately invisible, which made it exactly the kind of route that someone who had studied the building layout would identify and use. The door from the corridor into the main hallway had a keypad. The keypad required a 4-digit code that changed monthly. She pushed the door from the hallway side and it opened inward. The keypad only restricted entry from the corridor side, not exit, which was standard fire egress design and also a consistent vulnerability in hospital construction that she had now observed in 3 different medical facilities over the course of her career. The corridor itself was lit by overhead fluorescents, smelled of industrial detergent, and ran the length of the east side of the building. At the far end, a door led to the service elevator. She stood in the corridor and looked at the floor. Linoleum, industrial grade, light gray. She walked slowly from the access door toward the service elevator, watching the surface. There, a scuff mark at the corner where the corridor turned. Not from a cart. The angle was wrong for wheels. It was a heel pivot, the mark of someone changing direction quickly. And beside it, on the baseboard, a small red-brown smear the size of a thumbprint. Not a lot of blood. Enough. She stood up and looked at the service elevator door. Cale's voice came from the radio he'd given her before she'd come into the corridor. Camera footage shows 2 individuals entering the service elevator at 11:08. 1 male, 1 female. Third individual is not on camera. A pause. The female matches your description of the stairwell woman from earlier. 3 of them. The third one hadn't shown up on any camera. Which floor did the elevator go to? She asked. It shows the car going to the basement. The basement of Harlow Memorial contained the loading dock, the morgue, the central supply storage, and the physical plant. It also had a tunnel access that connected to the parking structure, a passage originally built for equipment transport that was now technically locked, access restricted, but that any competent advance team surveilling this building for 2 days would have found, tested, and marked as viable. She was already moving. She took the main elevator down, not the service elevator, because if they were watching for movement, they'd be watching the service elevator first, and hit the basement button and thought about the blood on the baseboard. It was a small amount, which meant it was incidental, which meant either Renata Ashby had been injured during the grab and the injury was minor, or the blood belonged to someone else. And neither option was good, but the first was better than the second. The basement was colder than the floors above and quieter with a specific underground quality of quiet. The HVAC systems made a low, continuous sound that masked footsteps, which was bad. The loading dock was to her left as she came off the elevator. She went left. The loading dock was empty at this hour. Deliveries were mornings, the dock crew broke for lunch at 11 and generally didn't come back until noon 30. The bay doors were down. The dock office, a small windowed room at the far end, was dark. She crossed the dock and stood at the tunnel access door. The lock was a keyed deadbolt. It was not locked. The bolt was extended but not engaged. Someone had unlocked it and pushed the bolt back without fully retracting it, leaving it sitting in the gap between door and frame, which was how you left a door when you wanted it to appear locked from a distance and open quickly on your way back through. She pushed it open. The tunnel was approximately 60 meters long, lit by cage-covered bulbs spaced 20 feet apart. It smelled of concrete and standing water. She stood at the entrance and listened. Voices. Not words, just the register of voices, low and male, from somewhere toward the parking structure end. She moved through the tunnel as quickly as she could manage while keeping her footsteps below the HVAC background noise, which meant shorter strides and balls of feet rather than heels, which she did automatically, without deciding to do it. She came to the midpoint of the tunnel. There was a woman sitting against the wall with her knees pulled to her chest, and both hands pressed flat against the tunnel floor on either side of her hips, which was the position of someone who was frightened and compliant, and trying to make themselves very small. Even in the poor light, even from this angle, Marlowe recognized the specific posture of someone who had been told to stay, and had decided that staying was the best available option. Renata Ashby looked up when she heard footsteps. Her face was a complicated thing. There was fear, real, physical fear, the kind that narrowed the eyes and shortened the breath. There was also something else that Marlowe didn't have time to catalog. "Can you walk?" Marlowe asked. Renata Ashby stared at her. "Can you walk?" Marlowe said again, not louder but more precisely. "I need a yes or no." "Yes." The word came out scratched, like it had been sitting in a dry place. "Then get up. We're going back the way I came. Renata stood. Her knee, the one scheduled for surgery, clearly hurt. She came up favoring the other leg, jaw tight. She looked at Marlowe with an expression that had several things in it and no clean way to organize them. There are two men, she said, at the other end. I know. They said, her voice caught. She steadied it. They said if anyone came through this tunnel, they would stop talking and walk, Marlowe said, not unkindly, just urgently, and she positioned herself behind Renata Ashby and started moving. They were 12 meters back toward the hospital when the voices at the far end changed register. Not louder, just different. The specific change that meant attention had shifted. The footsteps that followed were not trying to be quiet. Marlowe measured the distance, 40 meters to the hospital door, which she had left unlocked. Renata Ashby's compromised knee. Two men behind them who were not constrained by a patient's mobility. She made a decision. Keep going, she said to Renata. Don't stop. Don't look back. The door at the end is open. Go through it and call for anyone you see. Anyone at all. What are you? Go. Renata went. She moved faster than Marlowe would have predicted. When people were sufficiently motivated, a bad knee became a negotiable obstacle rather than an absolute one. She was 15 meters out and moving when Marlowe turned around. The two men were 20 meters behind her and closing. The one in front was the man from the scrubs. Without the scrubs now. In the dark clothes that made more sense for what he was actually doing. He was bigger than he'd looked from across the lobby, wide through the shoulders, moving with the economic efficiency of someone trained for exactly this kind of space. Behind him, the second man was slightly smaller, slightly faster. She had no weapon. She had no radio. She had a tunnel with cage bulb lighting and a concrete floor and 40 years of combined training that nobody in this building had thought was worth a second glance. The first man reached her in 4 seconds. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not clean, was not fast, and was not anything that would have looked like what it was to anyone watching without context. It was ugly and it hurt, and she made 2 mistakes and corrected for one of them and didn't fully correct for the other. What it ended with was the first man on the floor of the tunnel with his right arm bent at an angle it was not meant to bend, and the second man against the wall with Marlowe's forearm against his throat and his feet 8 inches off the ground. Not because she was strong enough to hold him there, she wasn't, not for long, but because his choices in that moment were to fight her grip and risk the pressure on his airway or to stay still, and staying still was what he chose. She held it for 10 seconds. He went gray. She let him down to the floor and stepped back and breathed. Her left side hurt in a specific way that meant she'd taken impact on the already scar-damaged tissue of her forearm, which produced a different quality of pain than impact on undamaged muscle, and which she had learned over years to absorb and continue through. She pressed her arm against her body once, recalibrated, and walked back toward the hospital door. She came out of the tunnel into the loading dock. Renata Ashby was standing just inside the dock, not moving. She had not apparently called for anyone. She was standing with both hands pressed against her mouth, looking at Marlowe with the expression of someone whose entire model of a situation had just been reconstructed from the ground up. Marlowe looked at her for a moment. I said call for anyone you see. I couldn't. Renata's hands dropped. I couldn't leave. Marlowe breathed out. There are 2 men in the tunnel. They need to be detained. Go to the stairwell door, open it, and tell whoever you find first that Garrett Briggs needs people at the tunnel access in the loading dock right now. Renata moved. This time, she didn't stop. Marlowe stood at the tunnel door and listened. Neither man had gotten up yet. Good. Her left arm was sending specific, consistent signals that she was categorizing as significant bruising and possibly a small soft tissue tear along the outer edge of the forearm. Painful, not dangerous, manageable. She pressed her back against the wall beside the tunnel door and waited. Briggs came through the stairwell 3 minutes later with 2 of his staff and a Callaway County Sheriff's deputy who had apparently arrived while she was in the basement, summoned by Pruitt's emergency call. The deputy's name was Okonkwo, according to her nameplate, and she had the efficient, unimpressed quality of someone who had driven to calls that turned out to be less than advertised enough times that she wasn't going to allocate astonishment prematurely. Marlowe told her about the tunnel in 2 sentences. Okonkwo went through the door with her hand on her holster. Briggs looked at Marlowe. He looked at her arm. You need... Later, she said. The patient on 2, he started. Is he secure? Perez is still on the door. Nobody's been near it. He hesitated. But there's something else. While all of this was happening, he stopped. She looked at him. What? Someone accessed the medication room on the third floor, he said. The automated dispensing cabinet. It logged an access attempt under a physician credential. The credential belongs to Dr. Harlan Fitch. She processed that. Harlan Fitch was the chief of internal medicine at Harlow Memorial. She had crossed paths with him a handful of times. A spare, precise man, mid-50s, the kind of physician who managed people through the specific authority of appearing never to be wrong. Was the access successful? She asked. It was. Briggs's jaw was tight. We don't know yet what was pulled. Which medications are in that cabinet? General formulary, but there's a restricted section that requires the physician code. Fitch's credential opened the restricted section. She stood very still for a moment. The restricted section of the third-floor dispensing cabinet contained, among other things, the paralytic agents used for anesthesia induction, and several high-concentration cardiac medications, and, depending on this quarter's inventory, a small stock of potassium chloride solution maintained for legitimate compounding purposes. Where's Fitch right now? She asked. That's the thing, Briggs said. He called in sick this morning. He hadn't been in the building. His credential had been used anyway, which meant either his access card and his PIN had been obtained by someone who wasn't him, or, and this was the version that landed harder, he had given them willingly. Before she could answer, her attention was taken by a sound from the stairwell. Not footsteps, but voices. Multiple, rapid, official. Not hospital staff voices. Something with more weight to it. She looked at Briggs. Did Prewitt call County? She asked. Yes. And County called someone else. He had an expression she couldn't immediately read. There are vehicles outside, multiple. What kind? Not police, he said. Federal plates, dark color. She looked at the stairwell door. It opened before she reached it. The man who came through first was wearing tactical gear over civilian clothing. No agency markings, no insignia, carrying a sidearm holstered and a radio in his left hand. He was followed by two others dressed the same way. Behind them, a woman in a dark suit with short gray hair cut bluntly at the jaw came through the door at a pace that was not rushed but covered ground very efficiently. The woman looked at the room. Her eyes moved through it in the systematic way of someone accustomed to walking into situations and needing to assess them fast. Then her eyes found Marlowe. She crossed to her directly. You're Voss, she said. Not a question. Marlowe looked at her. That depends on who's asking. My name is Aldine Farrow. She held out identification. Federal. An agency Marlowe recognized immediately and said nothing about. I'm going to need you to walk me through everything that happened, starting from when you first identified the IV line. Marlowe looked at the ID, then at Farrow's face. How do you know about the IV line? Because the man in room 2 called it in 90 minutes ago. Farrow put the ID away. He told us there was a nurse who'd caught it. He told us a name. She paused. He told us considerably more than a name. Marlowe was quiet for a moment. Walk with me, Farrow said. I need to secure your patient, and then I need to debrief you, in that order. She was already moving toward the elevator. The two men in the tunnel are being extracted. The woman from the stairwell was picked up in the parking structure 20 minutes ago. We're looking for a third. There's a third, Marlowe confirmed, moving alongside her. No camera image. Patients said the operational minimum for this kind was 3. Farrow glanced at her sideways. He told you the operational structure. He told me there would be at least 2, possibly 3. He didn't tell me anything else. He told you more than he should have. A brief pause. He usually does, when he decides someone's worth talking to. They reached the elevator. Farrow pressed the button for 2. The doors closed, and there was a moment of the particular intimacy that small, enclosed spaces created between people having serious conversations. How long were you in? Farrow asked, not looking at her, looking at the floor indicator. Marlowe didn't answer immediately. Long enough. What unit? I'd rather not. Farrow accepted that with a slight nod, the acknowledgement of someone who understood what that answer meant. The man in room 2. His name is Marcus Leland. He's been working with us for 11 months. What he was carrying to his meeting today would have dismantled a network that has been operational for 7 years in this country. She paused. 3 countries have been trying to dismantle it for 3 of those 7 years. Marlowe looked at the floor indicator. The people who tried to kill him this morning, Farrow continued, have resources. They had access to EMS dispatch communications, which is how they got to the IV line at the scene. They had a hospital employee who gave them entry. We're working on identifying who. And they had at least one person inside your hospital's administrative structure who was providing real-time information about patient movement and staff deployment. Marlowe thought about Prewitt's call, the county official who had asked for discretion. The call that had come 20 minutes after the unidentified patient arrived. The call that had redirected her attention toward administrative compliance at exactly the moment that compliance was most dangerous. Victor Prewitt, she said. Farrow looked at her. He received a call from a county-level official requesting discretion regarding the patient. He passed that information to the ER attending. He also pulled 2 security staff off their exit positions and brought them upstairs, which created the gap that allowed the woman in the visitor badge to access the second-floor stairwell. Marlowe kept her voice even. I don't know if he understood what he was participating in, but the information he acted on came from inside your network, not from a county official. Farrow was quiet for 3 seconds. How long did it take you to put that together? She asked. About 45 minutes after it happened. The elevator opened on 2. Farrow's tactical team split immediately, 2 going to the stairwell access to establish a perimeter, the 3rd moving to station outside the elevator. Farrow herself walked directly to the room at the end of the hall, where Perez was still standing with the dedication of a man who had decided that whatever was happening was above his grade and that his one job was to not move. Farrow knocked. The door opened from inside. Marcus Leland was sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed in the clothes he'd come in with, the torn knee, the blood-dark collar, and looking substantially worse than he had 90 minutes ago. The pale, pressed-down look of someone who'd been running on adrenaline and had now run through the reserves. He looked at Farrow, and something in his face eased, not much but genuinely, the way faces eased when people arrived who were supposed to arrive. Then he looked at Marlowe. She was right about the 3rd one, he said to Farrow. I know. Farrow moved to the window and looked out. We still don't have them. The medication cabinet on 3, Marlowe said from the doorway. A physician credential was used to access the restricted formulary while the tunnel situation was happening. That's the 3rd one's work. Farrow turned from the window. They weren't just trying to finish Marcus, Marlowe said. The tunnel was a secondary route, a fallback if the room approach was compromised, which it was. But while we were all moving to the tunnel, someone went to the 3rd floor and pulled medications from the restricted cabinet. That's not escape strategy. That's still operational. The room was very quiet. They're not done, Leland said. No, Marlowe said. Farrow's radio crackled. The voice on the other end was one of her team, from upstairs, and the words came through with the flat urgency of a transmission that was trying to compress something complicated into available time. Marlowe heard 3 words clearly before Farrow pressed the radio to her ear and moved to the corner of the room. Doctor, 3rd floor, down. The air changed. Farrow turned. Her face had shifted. Not broken, but rearranged into something harder and more specific. Callum Osei, she said. Is that your ER attending? Marlowe's chest went tight. Yes. My team found him in the stairwell on 3, Farrow said. He's alive. He'd been given something. They're working on identification now. He was unconscious when they found him, and he had his access badge removed. She paused. And before you ask, yes, his badge works on the restricted medication cabinet. Marlowe stood in the doorway. Several things simultaneously, which she had learned over years was survivable. The feeling, the acknowledgement, the immediate shelving of it for the moment when there was room. Osei's badge, the restricted cabinet access, not Fitch's credential, or not only Fitch's, which meant the earlier access had been exploratory, a test, and the actual pull had happened under Osei's badge, which meant the 3rd operative had been watching the ER attending all morning, had identified him as the access point, and had moved on him at exactly the moment the hospital's attention was in the basement. What was taken? She asked. Farrow looked at her. We don't know yet. We need to know now. She looked at Leland. Is there anyone in this building who has a reason to still be a target? Leland looked back at her. His expression had the particular quality of a man who was doing fast, painful arithmetic. "Yes," he said. "Who?" He opened his mouth. And then the overhead intercom, the hospital-wide intercom, the one used for emergencies and announcements, and the coded messages that staff recognized and visitors didn't, activated, not with a voice, with a tone. 3 short pulses, 1 long one. Marlowe knew that pattern. She had never heard it at Harlow Memorial before. She had heard it in 2 other places, in different countries, in circumstances she did not discuss. It was a medical emergency code, not a cardiac arrest, not a fire. The specific pattern that meant something was already wrong with a patient and the response team needed to move now, and the situation on the other end of that intercom was not the kind that a standard code team was equipped to handle. Her eyes went to Leland. His face confirmed it before he said anything. "That's not for me," he said quietly. Farrow was already on her radio. Marlowe was already in the hallway. The intercom pulsed again, 3 short, 1 long. And on the 3rd floor of Harlow Memorial Medical Center, in a room that nobody in this building's administrative structure had thought to flag, a man whose name was not on any census board and whose presence had been arranged through a channel that ran considerably higher than hospital administration was coding, silently, with a compound in his bloodstream that Marlowe recognized by its effect before she'd even reached the stairwell door, because she had seen it before. In a field, in the dark, in a country with a different name for justice. She hit the door at a run. The stairwell door hit the wall behind her, and she was already 3 steps up before it swung back. 3rd floor. She had come from 2. 1 flight. Her left arm was screaming from the tunnel, and she ran through it the way she had learned to run through things. Not ignoring them, not pretending, just allocating the pain to a part of her attention that could hold it while the rest of her did what needed doing. She came through the 3rd floor door, and the hallway was already wrong. 2 nurses were standing outside a room at the far end, one of them on the phone, one of them frozen in the particular way people froze when the thing happening in front of them had exceeded their training. The room was 317, a general observation room that was not supposed to have any patient in it. It had been listed as out of service for a maintenance issue since Monday, a faulty nurse call panel, which was the kind of minor facilities problem that took 3 days to get to and that nobody paid particular attention to. Someone had paid attention to it. Someone had known that a room listed as out of service would not appear on the census board, would not receive routine nursing checks, would not be flagged by the charge nurse when they did their hourly rounding. It was, functionally, invisible. She went through the door. The man in the bed was somewhere in his mid-60s, heavy through the chest, with the coloring of someone who had spent decades making decisions behind desks rather than outside. He was in street clothes, not a gown, which meant he had been placed here rather than admitted through any standard process. He was breathing, but the breathing was the specific pattern she had registered from the intercom code. Slow, deep, irregular, with the long pauses between exhales that indicated a depressant compound working on the brainstem's respiratory drive. She was at the bedside in 3 steps. His pulse was there, 52 beats per minute, weak at the radial but present. His pupils were equal and sluggishly reactive when she pulled her penlight from her pocket, which told her the compound had not yet crossed the threshold into irreversible neurological suppression. His lips had the faint bluish cast of someone whose oxygen saturation was dropping. "Get me a bag valve mask and oxygen from the wall," she said to the frozen nurse in the doorway. The nurse's name, according to her badge, was Tomoko Waris. She was perhaps 26 and had the look of someone in their first year of real clinical work, before the numbness set in. We don't have an order. Tomoko." Marlowe kept her hands moving, tilting his head, clearing his airway, repositioning. "Bag valve mask, oxygen, right now." Tomoko moved. The other nurse, older, steadier, was already on the phone calling a code team. Marlowe heard the overhead intercom respond within 15 seconds, which was fast, which meant the hospital's emergency systems were working even when the rest of it had stopped functioning as intended. She maintained the airway manually until Tomoko got back with the equipment, which took 40 seconds and felt like considerably longer. She connected the mask, squeezed the bag at the right rate, once every 5 seconds for an adult with a present pulse, and counted, and listened to his chest wall rise, and adjusted the seal once because the first seal was imperfect, and an imperfect seal was the same as no seal at all. The code team arrived at the 2-minute mark. There were 4 of them: a resident, 2 nurses from the rapid response pool, and a respiratory therapist who took over the bag without being asked because she recognized what she was looking at, and she knew her job. Marlowe stepped back 1 step and gave them room but didn't leave because she had information they didn't have, and they were going to need it. He was given something, she said to the resident, a young man named Barrett, who was running the code with the focused, slightly terrified competence of someone doing exactly what they'd been trained to do while hoping it was enough. Likely administered in the last 30 to 60 minutes, not IV. There's no line and no access site I can see. Probable oral or IM route. The compound profile matches an atropine antagonist or a central depressant. Breathing pattern suggests brainstem involvement. Pupils are still reactive. Cardiac is slow, but present. Barrett looked at her. How do you... I've seen it before. She kept her voice flat. You need to notify poison control now and get a full tox panel running. Don't wait for the panel before you treat. If this is what I think it is, the window is short. What do you think it is? She said the name of the compound. It was not a common one. It was not something on a standard hospital formulary. It was a name she knew from a different context entirely, and one she had never expected to say in a hospital in North Carolina, which told her something significant about the scale of what Marcus Leland had been carrying to his meeting. Barrett stared at her for half a second. Then he turned and started giving orders. Farrow came through the door 2 minutes later with one of her tactical team. She looked at the man in the bed. She looked at the code team working around him. She looked at Marlowe. He's alive, Marlowe said. Barely. They got to him through the out-of-service room. Someone knew the maintenance flag would keep him off the board. She paused. Who is he? Farrow was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was a decision. His name is Bernard Grael, she said. He's the deputy director of a federal oversight committee. He arrived in Callaway this morning to review a classified intelligence matter. It was not supposed to be anywhere near this hospital. Another pause. Someone moved him here. Moved him. Marlowe heard the word and turned it over. He came here willingly? He was told it was a safe location, that Leland had been brought here, and that the hospital was secure. Farrow's jaw was tight. Someone with enough credibility to redirect a deputy director gave him this address and this room number. She looked at the bed. It was a trap. The code team was working. Barrett had gotten the tox panel ordered and the first reversal agent running, and Grail's breathing was beginning to stabilize, slowly, unevenly, but the trend was in the right direction. The respiratory therapist had switched him to a non-rebreather mask, and his saturation was climbing. Marlowe stood back and let them work, and thought about what Farrow had said. Someone with enough credibility to redirect a deputy director. Someone who knew that Marcus Leland had been brought to Harlow Memorial. Someone who knew which room. The census board. The patient movement. The real-time information that Farrow had mentioned earlier. Someone inside the hospital's administrative structure who had been feeding information to the network. And the call that had come to Prewitt from a county official who had requested discretion. She had identified Prewitt as the conduit, but conduits received information from sources. She thought about the medication cabinet, Harlan Fitch's credential, tested first. Then Osei's badge, used after Osei had been taken down in the stairwell. 2 physicians, 2 access points targeted sequentially. The third operative working a systematic list. She thought about who had the administrative access to know which physicians had badge access to the restricted formulary. She thought about who had known, well before the situation in the tunnel developed, that Callum Osei was the ER attending today. She thought about Victor Prewitt, who had called down to the ER at 10:47 a.m. She had the time in her head from when Osei had mentioned it, asking that the patient be kept quiet. Not asking what was happening, not expressing concern, asking for a specific kind of information management. She crossed the room and found Farrow at the window. Prewitt, she said, your inside source. He may not have understood the full scope, but he was the channel. The call he received, trace it. And when you do, I think you'll find it didn't come from a county official. Farrow looked at her. And Harlan Fitch, Marlowe continued, find out when he called in sick, whether the call came from his personal phone, whether anyone can actually place him outside this building this morning. Farrow's radio was already in her hand. She left the room, speaking rapidly and quietly into the radio, and Marlowe stayed with the code team until Barrett straightened up from the bedside with the specific posture of someone who had done what they could and was now waiting to see if it was enough. "He's holding," Barrett said. He sounded exhausted. He was probably 29 years old, and he had just run a code on a compound he'd never treated before in a room that shouldn't have had a patient in it. "We need to transfer him to the ICU." "Do it," Marlowe said. "Make sure Pharaoh's team knows the transfer route." Barrett looked at her. He had been looking at her periodically since she'd walked through the door. The same series of small recalibrations she'd been receiving all morning. "Who are you?" he said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. "I'm a nurse," she said. He looked at her arm, back at her face. "Right," he said, with the tone of a man who understood that this was the answer he was going to get, and that it was probably accurate and also profoundly insufficient as a description. The transfer team arrived and Marlowe moved into the hallway. It was 12:41 p.m. She had been in this building for approximately 7 hours, the last 5 of which she had spent suspended, unauthorized, and operating on the specific combination of clinical instinct and trained assessment that 17 years of accumulated experience produced in a person whether or not their badge was active. Her left arm had progressed from painful to significantly painful. She needed to have someone look at it. She was not going to do that yet. Briggs appeared at the end of the hallway, coming from the stairwell, and beside him was a woman Marlowe didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, early 50s, with the purposeful stride of someone who had been moving fast for several hours. Behind them were 2 individuals in plain clothes who were very clearly not hospital staff, because hospital staff didn't move with that particular configuration of awareness, tracking doors and corners and the positions of everyone else in the hallway with the peripheral attention of people whose job required it. The woman reached Marlowe first. "Special Agent Dana Okafor," she said. "FBI. I've been briefed by Agent Pharaoh." She didn't extend a hand. They were both moving. "We have a situation with Prewitt." "What kind?" "He's gone." Marlowe stopped walking. "Gone." "His office is empty. His car is still in the administrative lot. We have camera footage of him leaving the administrative floor at 12:08, 11 minutes after Pharaoh's team arrived in the building." Okafor kept her voice level, the practiced level of someone delivering bad news without making it worse. "He was moving fast. He took the service elevator to the basement. The tunnel." "The tunnel was open," Marlowe said. "I left it unlocked when I came back through." Okafor absorbed this without reaction. "We have people at the parking structure end. He hasn't surfaced there. He may still be in the tunnel, or he found a different exit." She paused. "He had his hospital master keycard, which accesses all utility corridors in the building." Marlowe thought about the building layout. The utility corridors she knew, from 2 years of working here, connected to several secondary points. The physical plant, a maintenance egress at the north wall, the old wing connector that had been sealed when the new pavilion was built but sealed imperfectly. She knew, because 3 months ago a facilities worker had propped it open with a chair and forgotten about it, and she had seen it during a late shift and mentioned it to the facilities desk, and it had been on their repair list ever since. She told Okafor. Okafor relayed it into her radio before Marlowe finished the sentence. "I need to ask you something," Okafor said, still walking. "Pharaoh told me about the medication cabinet, the compound used on Grail. Do you have any idea how someone would have obtained it in a quantity sufficient for a single adult dose?" "It's not a domestic pharmaceutical compound," Marlowe said. "It would have to come in from outside through a controlled channel, which means someone in the network had a supply and brought it in, or someone with procurement access arranged it in advance." She paused. "How far in advance would that require?" "Minimum 3 days, possibly longer." "Then Grail was always the primary target," Marlowe said. "Leland was the visible operation, the one designed to draw resources and attention. Grail was why they were actually here." Okafor glanced at her. "That's our working theory. If Grail dies, whatever he was reviewing with the Oversight Committee dies with him." "Not quite, but it delays it by long enough to matter." Okafor stopped walking as her radio produced a burst of rapid transmission. She listened. Her face changed. "They found Prewitt," she said. "Where?" "North Utility Corridor. He wasn't trying to leave." She looked at Marlowe with an expression that had something complicated in it. "He was trying to reach the ICU. They're moving Grail to the ICU right now." Marlowe was moving before Okafor finished the sentence. The ICU at Harlow Memorial was on the 5th floor. The north utility corridor connected to the 5th floor's east service access. If Prewitt had the master keycard and he knew the building's utility map, and he had been the director of patient services for 6 years, which meant he knew every access point in the facility, then the route from the north corridor to the ICU's service access was direct and fast, and almost entirely off the main camera grid. She took the main elevator to 5, not because it was faster, but because the stairwell would put her behind the transfer team and she needed to be ahead of them. The elevator opened on 5. She went left toward the ICU entrance, and she went fast, and she came around the corner past the waiting area with the stacked chairs and the 2 bright overhead lights, and she saw the transfer team coming from the other direction, gurney, monitors, 2 nurses, Barrett, and she saw the service access door at the far end of the ICU corridor swing open from the inside. Prewitt came through it. He had his ID badge in his hand and his phone in the other hand, and he was moving with the specific desperate efficiency of a man who had made a series of decisions that had compounded past the point of retrieval, and who knew it and was running on the momentum of not stopping rather than any coherent plan. He looked at the transfer team. He looked at Grail on the gurney. He hadn't seen Marlowe yet. She was behind him, 20 feet, coming from his left. She said, "Prewitt." He turned. His face was not the face of the man who had sat across from her in the conference room that morning and used the words patient comfort and exceptional circumstances. That man had been composed, insulated by institutional position, and the practiced confidence of someone who had never been on the wrong side of a consequential situation. The man who turned to look at her in the ICU corridor had none of that left. He looked like what he was, someone who had underestimated everything, including the specific mourning that had accumulated around him. "I didn't know what they were going to do," he said. His voice had the quality of something coming out under pressure that had been held a long time. "I want you to understand that. I received the call and I thought it was—" "I don't need you to explain it to me," Marlowe said. "I need you to step away from that gurney. I'm not here to—" He looked at Grail. His jaw worked. "I was told to make sure he arrived, that's all. I was told to confirm his location and make sure he arrived. To the ICU. Yes. And tell me what you were supposed to do once you confirmed that." He said nothing. The transfer team had stopped. Barrett was looking between Marlowe and Prewitt with the expression of a man who was prepared to do something but needed 10 more seconds of information to know what. "You were going to call someone," Marlowe said. "Confirm his room number, his care team, the monitoring setup." She kept her voice flat. Not angry, factual. "You understood that you were providing positioning intelligence on a patient who had already survived 1 attempt." Prewitt's face did something complicated and painful. "I thought the original call was from the county emergency coordinator," he said. He identified himself properly. He had the right access codes for the interagency protocol. "I had no reason to—" He stopped. "By the time I understood—" "When did you understand?" A long pause. "When Farrow arrived," he said. Okafor came through the stairwell door at the end of the corridor, 2 agents behind her. She took in the scene with the rapid assessment Marlowe had come to recognize as her default mode and crossed to Prewitt with the specific economy of someone who had done this before. "Victor Prewitt," she said, "I'm placing you in federal custody pending investigation." Prewitt looked at her. He looked at Marlowe. His expression had the exhausted, hollowed quality of someone who had been carrying something wrong for long enough that the weight had become its own kind of structure. And now that the structure was collapsing, there was nothing underneath it. He didn't resist. Okafor's agents moved him back through the corridor, and the transfer team, after a 5-second collective recalibration, continued with the gurney. Barrett looked at Marlowe as he passed. "You knew he was going to be here," he said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." "I knew where he was going," she said. "I didn't know if I'd get here first." Barrett nodded slowly and kept walking. Grail was admitted to the ICU at 1:03 p.m. His saturation was at 94% on supplemental oxygen. His blood pressure was low but sustaining. The reversal agent had opened enough of the compound's mechanism to give him room, and the ICU team knew what they were dealing with now, which was the most important thing, because a compound correctly identified was a compound that could be countered. He was not safe, but he was not dying in the next hour. Marlowe stood in the hallway outside the ICU and let herself breathe for the first time since the stairwell. Her arm was at the level of pain that required active management. She pressed it against her side and held it there and made a list, internally, of everything she knew and everything she didn't. Pharaoh appeared from the direction of the elevator bank. "Fitch," Marlowe said. Pharaoh's expression was the answer before the words. "He was in the building. He's been in his office since 7 this morning. His call-in this morning was placed using a recording of his voice. Someone had access to a prior voicemail and spliced it. Facilities recorded an access log. His physical badge was used at the physician entrance at 6:48 a.m., which means he was here before most of the day staff." She paused. "He's being interviewed right now." "Is he cooperating?" "He's confused," Pharaoh said. "Genuinely, I think. He has no idea why anyone would use his credential. He didn't report his access card lost because it wasn't. He had it on him all morning." Another pause. "Someone cloned it." Cloned, not stolen. Cloned, which required physical proximity to the original card for a matter of seconds, and the right equipment, and a reason to have targeted Fitch specifically. "His access level," Marlowe said, "compared to other physicians on staff." "Highest on the medical staff," Pharaoh said. "He's on every committee. His badge opens the pharmacy, the formulary, the research wing, the administrative floor." She looked at Marlowe. "Whoever planned this did it well in advance. They identified the credential with the most access, and they found a way to clone it. And the person who did that cloning," Marlowe said, "has been inside this building long enough to get close to Fitch without raising attention." Pharaoh was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "We think it may be someone on staff." The weight of that settled in the hallway. "Not Prewitt," Marlowe said. "He was being used. He didn't have the technical sophistication for a card clone, and he didn't have the operational knowledge to coordinate the tunnel approach and the room placement." She paused. "Someone else?" "Yes." "Someone who knows this building the way a staff member knows it?" "Yes." "And who would have had legitimate reason to be close to Fitch, close enough to clone the card?" Pharaoh said nothing. Marlowe thought about who had regular, unremarkable access to the physicians on this floor, who moved through the building without attracting attention, who would know about the out-of-service room and the maintenance flag on 317. Who would know the utility corridor map well enough to draw a route from the basement to the 5th floor without referencing anything? She thought about Briggs, not because she suspected him, but because she was thinking about who had access to the building's security infrastructure, the camera systems, the keypad codes, the real-time staff movement data. Then she thought about something else. The 2 security guards that Prewitt had pulled off the exits this morning, the ones he'd brought upstairs when he'd come to confront her. He had redirected them, but someone had suggested he do it. Someone had called Prewitt and told him that Marlowe was creating a problem on 2, which had motivated Prewitt to go up there personally with an escort. That call had come from inside the building. She turned and walked back toward the nursing station. The charge nurse on 5 was a man named Roland Prieto, who had been standing at his station for the past 3 hours, looking like a person whose shift had taken a direction he had not anticipated, and who was handling it by doing his immediate job as correctly as possible and leaving the larger questions to the people who appeared to be equipped for them. "The call that went to administration this morning," Marlowe said. "The one that brought Prewitt to the 2nd floor. Who placed it?" Roland looked at her. I wasn't on 2 this morning. Is there a way to pull the internal call log? Every call placed from a hospital phone today." "That's an IT function. I don't have access to—" "Can you get IT on the line right now?" Roland picked up the phone. The IT department at Harlow Memorial was 1 floor down, in a section of the building that nobody visited unless their computer stopped working. The person who answered was a man named Devraj Kuo, who sounded deeply unhappy about the day he was having, which was fair. He pulled the internal call log for the administrative director's line. The call had come at 11:22 a.m., exactly when Marlowe had been moving toward the elevator to go to 6. It had been placed from a hospital phone. Extension 441 scene. She looked at Roland. "What is extension 441 ? Roland's face changed. "That's the security supervisor's office," he said. "Not Briggs's office." Briggs was the security manager. The supervisor's office was his second-in-command, a position currently held by a man Marlowe had met once, briefly, 3 months ago during a fire drill, whose name she had not retained and whose face she was now reconstructing from a 30-second interaction, and finding that it reconstructed with the specific, forgettable quality of someone who had arranged it that way. She looked at Pharaoh, who had followed her to the nursing station. She said the extension number. Pharaoh's radio was out. And then, before Pharaoh finished the transmission, the lights went out. Not all of them. The emergency generators caught it in under 2 seconds, the way they were designed to, and the hallway shifted from full overhead fluorescent to the lower amber-tinted emergency lighting that gave the hospital its nighttime quality. But 2 seconds of darkness in a building full of monitoring equipment was 2 seconds of alarm cascades, 2 seconds of ventilators switching to battery, 2 seconds in which every ICU monitor in the building flatlined and then reset. 2 seconds was enough. Marlo was moving before the emergency lights finished coming on, because she knew what a targeted power interruption to a hospital's main grid could do to the ICU's monitoring interface. She knew it took approximately 45 seconds for the central monitoring station to reboot and re-establish patient feeds after an unplanned outage. And in those 45 seconds, a patient in room 1 of the ICU was being monitored only by the bedside unit and the nurse physically in the room. And she knew that the security supervisor who had just placed a call to redirect the administrative director this morning would know exactly how long the central monitoring reboot took, because it was in the security handbook, which he had written. She hit the ICU doors at a run, and she was yelling for the charge nurse before she was through them, and she was counting down from 45 in her head, and she had 17 seconds left when she came through the door of room 1 and found exactly what she'd known she would find and exactly what she'd been too slow to prevent reaching the door before she did. The man standing beside Bernard Grail's bed was not in scrubs, not in civilian clothes, not in any of the configurations she'd been cataloging all day. He was in a Harlow Memorial Security polo shirt with his name on the badge and his hands at his sides and an expression that had stopped being the face he wore for colleagues about 6 seconds ago. He looked at Marlo. She looked at him. The room was very quiet except for the single-tone alarm of the bedside monitor that was working exactly as designed, and which nobody except the two of them could hear in the 41 seconds before the central station came back online. "Step away from the bed," she said. He didn't move, and in his right hand, which had been at his side, there was a syringe. The syringe was a 10 milliliter standard Luer lock, the kind that lived in every medication cart on every floor of this building, which meant it had not been brought in from outside, which meant he had pulled it from somewhere in this hospital in the last 40 minutes, while everyone's attention had been in the basement and the tunnel and the stairwells. His name, according to his badge, was Ray Sauter. She had met him once, 30 seconds during a fire drill. She had not remembered his face, but she remembered now that he had held a clipboard and directed people toward the exit with the specific quiet authority of someone comfortable managing the movement of others. She had registered it as competence. She understood now it was practice. "There are federal agents 12 seconds from this door," she said. "I know." His voice was even. Not panicked, not defiant, just even, the voice of someone who had already calculated this and arrived at a position. "That's why I need you to move." "I'm not moving." He looked at the syringe, then at her. "You don't know what's in this." "No," she said, "but I know what you were going to do with it." He took one step toward the bed. She moved simultaneously, not toward him, sideways, putting herself between him and the IV access point on Grail's arm, which was what he needed to reach and which she was now physically blocking. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't strategic, it was the simplest available geometry, her body in the way. He stopped. They stood 3 feet apart in the amber emergency lighting with the bedside monitor alarming its single persistent tone and Bernard Grail between them, breathing shallowly, unconscious, and entirely dependent on the next 15 seconds going a specific way. "You can't hold that position forever," Sauter said. "I don't need forever," she said. "I need 30 seconds. He moved. It was fast, faster than the tunnel, faster than anything that had happened today. Because he was not the men in the tunnel, who had been capable, but operating on a plan that had already fractured by the time she'd encountered them. Sauter was operating on a plan that was down to its last option, and last option plans had a specific quality of commitment to them. He came for her left side. She had known he would because her left arm was visibly compromised, and compromised limbs were the obvious target, the logical approach. The thing any trained person would identify in the first 3 seconds of assessing an opponent. She had been compromised before. She had learned in places and times that had not been kind about the lesson, that obvious targets could be managed. She took the hit on the forearm. It was bad. The pain that came out of it was significant and immediate. And she used the momentum of it to turn her body and get her right hand on his wrist, the wrist with the syringe, and she held it, not trying to break the grip, just controlling the direction of the needle while she used her weight and the edge of the bed frame and the specific leverage of someone who was not trying to win a fight, but trying to prevent a syringe from reaching an IV line for the next 22 seconds. The door hit the wall. Two of Pharaoh's tactical team came through it, and they did not hesitate, and they did not ask questions because they had been running toward this room since Pharaoh's radio call, and they had enough information to act on. Sauter was on the floor in 4 seconds. The syringe was on the floor beside him, contents undelivered, needle cap still on the bedside table where he'd set it when he'd drawn it up, and which Marlowe had not noticed until now, which meant some part of her attention had been in the wrong place, which was human, which was what happened when you were running on adrenaline and a damaged arm in 7 hours of accumulated crisis. She stood up. She looked at Grail. His IV line was intact. His monitor was alarming because the central station hadn't come back yet, and not because anything had changed in his condition. She checked his pulse manually. Present, 58, a little stronger than before. She checked his airway. She straightened the oxygen line that had shifted slightly during the struggle. Then she sat down on the floor. Not because she chose to, because her legs made the decision before she did. She sat on the floor of Bernard Grail's ICU room with her back against the bed frame and her damaged arm pressed against her body, and she breathed slowly, the way she had learned to breathe in the aftermath of situations where breathing was the first recovery step and everything else came after. The central monitoring station came back online. The alarm stopped. The room filled with the normal sounds of ICU equipment doing its job. One of Pharaoh's agents crouched down in front of her, young, male, with the expression of someone who had been trained to assess injury and was now doing it. "Are you hurt?" "My arm," she said. "I'll need it looked at." "Okay." He stayed crouched. "Can you get up?" "Yes," she said. "In a minute." He waited. That was the right thing to do, and he did it without being asked, which she noted and appreciated in the specific way that small right things were appreciated after a day full of wrong ones. After a minute, she got up. What followed was not fast, and it was not clean, and it did not feel in the immediate hours of it like anything that resembled resolution. Resolution was a word for things that had finished. What happened in the afternoon and evening of that day was the beginning of a much longer process that would take months to complete, and that would, in its completion, be significantly more consequential than anything that had happened inside the walls of Harlow Memorial. But certain things finished that day. Ray Sauter was taken into federal custody at 1:47 p.m. The contents of the syringe he'd drawn up were identified by the lab as a concentrated potassium chloride solution, the same compound type that had been placed in Marcus Leland's IV line that morning, drawn from the restricted formulary cabinet that Osei's cloned badge had accessed. Sauter had been the security supervisor for 4 years. He had written the building's emergency protocols. He had mapped every camera blind spot, every utility corridor access point, every maintenance flag in the building's facilities system. He had cloned Fitch's badge 3 weeks earlier during a routine physician security briefing, which he had conducted himself, which had required him to handle participants' credentials for verification, which nobody had found unusual because it was his job. He had been placed inside Harlow Memorial 11 months ago, the same 11 months that Marcus Leland had been working with Pharaoh's agency. Not a coincidence. Pharaoh explained this to Marlowe in a small family consultation room on the second floor, while a physician named Anita Sewell wrapped Marlowe's forearm, soft tissue tear along the lateral edge, no fracture, significant bruising, a care plan that involved compression and rest, and 2 medications that Marlowe accepted without argument, because her arm had stopped being manageable by the time they sat down and had moved into the range of genuinely distracting. Sauter was the anchor, Pharaoh said. The operational team came in for the day. He was the infrastructure, the person who made it possible for a team to operate inside this building as if they knew it. She paused. He's been feeding building intelligence for months. Staff schedules, administrative patterns, access protocols, everything a team would need to operate here without triggering the security systems, because he was the security system. The power outage, Marlowe said, controlled from the physical plant. He had the access codes. He timed it for the ICU reboot window. Farrow looked at her. He knew the handbook because he wrote it. Sewell finished wrapping the arm and said something about elevation and ice and a follow-up in 48 hours. Marlowe thanked her. Sewell left. Prewitt, Marlowe said, cooperating fully. The county official who called him was a synthetic identity, a phone number and a credential set that traced back to a communications node. The network had been running for 2 years. Prewitt had interacted with this identity before, in a legitimate context, which is how the credibility was established. Farrow folded her hands. He's not going to be charged. He may lose his job. That's a hospital matter, not ours. But he wasn't knowingly involved. He suspended me because a donor's wife complained about my scars, Marlowe said. It came out without anger, just factual. Yes, Farrow said. He did. They sat with that for a moment. Grail, Marlowe said. Stable. ICU team says the reversal agent worked. He'll need several days, but the neurological indicators are good. Farrow paused. He asked about you. An hour ago, when he was coherent enough to ask. He wanted to know who the nurse was. Marlowe said nothing. He knew someone had intervened, Farrow said. He'd been conscious briefly in the tunnel. He didn't know where he was, but he registered that someone was there who wasn't supposed to be, and that whoever it was had come from the hospital direction. She looked at Marlowe directly. He said the person who found him told him to get up and walk. He said the tone of it was the only reason he believed he could. Marlowe looked at the bandage on her arm. And Leland? She asked. Being transferred this afternoon to a secure facility for debriefing. His testimony combined with what the network's surviving operatives are going to say. The 2 men from the tunnel have already started talking separately, which is what happens when you separate people who were never fully aligned, is going to produce enough to dismantle 6 years of operational infrastructure. Farrow's voice was as level as it had been all day, which was a kind of discipline Marlowe recognized and respected. It won't be public. Most of it will never be public, but it will be done. Marlowe nodded. He asked me to tell you something, Farrow said. Leland. What? He said she was right about the IV line. Farrow's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent. He said it like you'd argued about it. I didn't argue, Marlowe said. I just pulled it. What? Garrison Ashby arrived at the hospital at 4:15 p.m. Not because anyone had called him. Because the version of the news that was being released, the controlled fragment that Farrow's agency had approved for public dissemination, which said only that a federal operation had concluded at Harlow Memorial following a security incident, had reached him through sources she would never know, and he had come in the way powerful people came to places, fast, with purpose, trailing the specific gravity of a man who was used to being the most important person in any room and who had just discovered that he might not have been today. He found Marlowe in the hallway outside the ICU. She was sitting in one of the waiting area chairs with her arm elevated on the armrest and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she looked exactly like what she was. A person who had been awake for 11 hours and had spent 5 of them doing something that had nothing to do with rest. Garrison Ashby was 64, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had been wealthy long enough that wealth was not a costume but a posture. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her arm, at her face, at the federal agents at the end of the hallway. My wife, he said. Is she? She's fine, Marlowe said. She's been moved to a standard room on 4. Her knee procedure is being rescheduled. He breathed out, a long, complicated exhale. She told me what happened. In the tunnel. He stopped. She told me who brought her out. Marlowe said nothing. I owe you, he started. You don't owe me anything, she said. She was a patient in this hospital. That's the job. Ashby looked at her with an expression that had several things in it. The discomfort of someone being offered a simplicity they hadn't earned, and something raw underneath it. My wife said, he paused, choosing words carefully, which was not his natural mode. She said you went back into that tunnel after her, that you'd been suspended, that you didn't have to be there at all. No, Marlowe said. I didn't. Why did you? She thought about it. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer, not a deflection. Because she was there and she needed help, she said. That's it. That's the whole answer. Ashby was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the ICU doors. He looked back at her. The administration, he said. What they did this morning. What my wife's reaction caused. He stopped again. I've been a significant donor to this institution for a long time. I intend to use that relationship to make certain that what happened to you today doesn't happen again. Not here. Not to anyone. He said it steadily, without performance, like a man making an accounting, not an announcement. I don't know if that means anything to you. It means something, Marlowe said. Whether it changes anything is a different question. He nodded. He seemed to understand that was the correct answer, and that he was going to have to sit with it. He went to find his wife. The formal process took longer than the day. The hospital board convened an emergency session 4 days later. The agenda included the termination of 3 senior administrative staff, Prewitt, who had submitted his resignation the morning after, and 2 others who had been identified in the internal review as having participated in a pattern of donor-influenced personnel decisions that had no clinical basis. The board's statement, when it was released, used careful language that said very little directly and implied considerably more. What it said directly was this: Nurse Marlowe Voss's suspension was rescinded, effective immediately, with full back pay for the period of interruption. The record of the suspension was expunged. Douglas Keat, who had not slept well in 4 days, came to find her in the break room on the morning she came back and said, I should have said something. This morning, when they called you in, I should have said something. She looked at him. He meant it. It was inadequate, and he knew it, and he was saying it anyway, which was the most honest thing available. Yes, she said. You should have. He nodded. He got his coffee. He went back to work. That was the thing about returning. It was not triumphant. It was ordinary. The floor had patients who needed medication rounds and vital signs and someone to notice when they weren't quite right. The IV pumps alarmed. The supply cart needed restocking. The physician who had written an unclear order at midnight was now not answering his pager, which was not new, and the charge nurse was managing it the same way it always got managed. She did her job. She did it well, the way she had always done it, and nobody on the floor made a speech about it, and the day moved forward the way days did. Farrow came back to the hospital 12 days later. Not officially. She came through the main entrance in civilian clothes and found Marlowe at the end of her shift, and they stood in the parking lot in the March cold because that was where Marlowe had ended up, and the parking lot was as good a place as any. Grail is out of the ICU, Farrow said. He'll be discharged to a rehabilitation facility next week. Good. The network. Farrow looked at the sky briefly. The operation is concluded. Sauter and the tunnel team will be in federal detention pending trial. The timeline is long. These things are always long, but it's done. She paused. And there's something else. Marlowe waited. The program that Leland was supporting, Farrow said carefully. The classified medical operations infrastructure. There's a position in it, not field work, consultation, training design, working with personnel who operate in environments where conventional medical support isn't available. She looked at Marlowe directly. Leland recommended you. Grail seconded it. I've been authorized to extend the offer formally. The parking lot was quiet except for a distant ambulance siren, the ordinary soundtrack of the work Marlowe had been doing for 2 years before today. She thought about what Farrow was offering. She knew what it was. Knew it from the inside, from the version of herself that had existed before the scars, before the settlement of choosing this instead of that. She thought about what she'd been, and about what she'd chosen, and about whether those 2 things were actually different from each other, or whether she had spent several years acting as if they were because the story was easier that way. She looked at the hospital's main entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see the lobby, the information desk, the elevator bank, the chairs where families sat with the specific exhausted tension of people who were waiting to find out if the person they loved was going to be all right. I'm going to stay, she said. Farrow didn't look surprised. I thought you might. I'm not declining because the other thing is lesser. She found the words slowly, because they were real, and real things required work. I'm staying because this is what I chose, and because what happened last week didn't change that. It confirmed it. She looked at her bandaged arm. The people in there need somebody who pays attention, who notices things. That's a job too. It's a good job, Pharaoh said, and she said it without condescension, with the simple acknowledgement of someone who understood the weight of a decision and was not diminishing it by calling it the wrong one. They stood in the cold for another minute. Leland also asked me to give you something, Pharaoh said. She reached into her jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He wrote it by hand. He said he didn't trust it to be transmitted. Marlowe took it. She opened it later, in her car, before she drove home. The handwriting was compressed and slightly irregular, the handwriting of someone who didn't write by hand often and didn't have time to make it clean. It said, "You caught the thing nobody else caught. You stayed when you had every reason to leave. I don't know what you were before this, and I know you don't talk about it. But whatever it was, it made you what you are now. Don't let anybody take that. Not a badge, not a conference room, not a woman who doesn't know what your scars mean." ML. She folded it back up. She sat with it for a moment. Then she started the car. The thing about being underestimated, the real thing, the thing that lived inside the experience rather than around it, was that it was almost never about the person who was doing it. Renata Ashby had seen a scar and reacted to it from a place so shallow and so unexamined that she hadn't even recognized it as cruelty. Victor Pruitt had chosen money over medicine with the ease of someone who had done it so many times. The choice had stopped feeling like a choice. The board had written a policy, and the policy had a gap, and Marlowe had fallen through it because the gap was shaped exactly like her. None of them had been trying to erase her. They had simply not seen her as something that could matter in a way they hadn't pre-approved. That was the nature of it. The dismissal was not personal. It was structural and reflexive and almost thoughtless, which in some ways made it harder to be angry at, and in other ways made the anger cleaner, because it wasn't about her at all. It was about what people allowed themselves to see. She had spent 2 years at Harlow being the nurse with the scars, the one who came in early and left without making noise about it, the one who noticed things and said them quietly and was correct in ways that nobody made a formal note of because quiet correctness didn't generate the kind of data that administration tracked. She had not minded. That was the part people always got wrong when they told the story. They assumed the quiet was a wound, a concession, a holding of the breath until recognition arrived. It was not. The quiet was the work. The work was the point. The recognition, when it came, was not the destination. It was just what happened when the work was too large to ignore anymore. She drove home. She made dinner badly. She had never been a patient cook, and tiredness made it worse. And what she produced was technically edible and not particularly good, and she ate it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like a commitment she wasn't ready to make. She looked at her arm. She thought about the man in the tunnel who had reached for a weapon that wasn't there. She thought about Bernard Grail breathing on the floor of a room that wasn't on the census board. She thought about Renata Ashby standing in the loading dock, not leaving, unable to explain why she'd stayed. People were strange. They were inconsistent and afraid and capable of extraordinary things and ordinary cruelty, often in the same hour. Renata Ashby had screamed at Marlowe's scars in the morning and stood in a tunnel in the afternoon, unwilling to move until she knew Marlowe was coming back through it. Those two things were both true. People contained them simultaneously, and that was not a paradox that needed resolving. It was just people. She went to bed. She slept. 3 weeks later, the hospital board announced the establishment of a new initiative, the framework for which had been quietly drafted by Garrison Ashby's legal team and presented to the board with the specific weight of a man who understood that money, when directed well, could function as accountability. It was called the Clinical Excellence and Dignity Standard, and its provisions included binding protections for nursing staff against patient-directed discrimination based on physical appearance, mandatory review procedures for any suspension made without documented clinical cause, and an annual report to the board on personnel decisions involving donor relationships. It was not a perfect document. It had gaps in language that would require interpretation and a committee that would need watching. Marlowe knew this because Douglas Keat told her, and she listened, and she told him which sections needed sharper language, and he wrote it down. She was asked to speak at the board presentation. She said no. She said, "Send someone who wants to talk. I want to work." They sent someone else, and the initiative passed, and Marlowe was in room 312 at the time, managing a patient whose morning labs had trended the way she'd known they would trend. And she sat with him while the medication dripped in and he asked her about the scars on her arm, and she told him, as she always told people when they asked directly and with genuine curiosity rather than revulsion, old injury. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. She looked at her arm. "Sometimes." "Worth it?" She thought about the helicopter, about the men she'd pulled from it, about the heat and the sound and the specific focused terror of knowing what she was doing and choosing to keep doing it. She thought about a parking lot in March, cold air, a piece of paper folded in her jacket pocket. She thought about a man reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, and a woman who didn't leave a tunnel, and a deputy director breathing in a room that wasn't on any board. "Yes," she said. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. She adjusted his IV rate, updated his chart, and moved to the next patient. The floor was full. The work was waiting. Outside the windows of Harlow Memorial, the spring light was doing what spring light did in North Carolina, arriving at a slant through the window glass and laying across the floor in long, pale rectangles that moved as the morning moved, slow and indifferent and completely undisturbed by everything that had happened in this building, which was as it should be. The light did not care who had been underestimated. It did not track what had been proven or to whom. It came through the window and crossed the floor and did what it had always done. And the people in this building, the frightened ones in the beds, the tired ones in the hallways, the ones who would never know what had almost happened here, and the ones who would never forget it, went on living inside it. Marlowe Voss went to check on her patients. That was the job. That was always the job. And some days, not every day, not cleanly, not without cost, it was exactly enough.